Bank security kicked out a poor old woman. Until she showed them a $980 million check. The woman nobody noticed. Watch what happens when a poor elderly woman is thrown out of a bank, but everything changes the moment she reveals a $980 million check. You won't believe their reaction. An elderly gentleman in an expensive suit nodded in agreement. I've been banking here for 20 years, and I've never seen anything so unprofessional. The lady was clearly being discriminated against based on her appearance. Even some of Morrison's own staff began to look uncomfortable as the reality of the situation crystallized. Several tellers who had watched Margaret sit in the corner for hours began to realize that their indifference had contributed to the crisis now facing their employer. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. I pray may the good God Almighty bless and preserve you and your family. Amen. The morning sun cast long shadows through the gleaming glass windows of First National Bank as Margaret Thompson shuffled slowly down the marble steps. At 78 years old, her weathered hands gripped the worn leather handbag that had been her companion for over 30 years. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her faded blue dress, the same one she'd worn to church every Sunday for the past decade, hung loosely on her small frame. Margaret had learned long ago to blend into the background. In a world that often overlooked the elderly, she had perfected the art of invisibility. But today was different. Today, she carried with her a secret that would change everything. As she approached the imposing bank entrance, her heart pounded with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The automatic doors swooshed open, revealing the opulent interior of one of the city's most prestigious financial institutions. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting prismatic rainbows across the polished marble floors. Well-dressed customers moved efficiently through the space, their expensive shoes clicking against the stone. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped inside. The transformation was immediate. Conversations quieted as heads turned in her direction. A security guard near the entrance straightened his posture, his eyes narrowing as they took in her modest appearance. The tellers behind their bulletproof glass looked up from their work, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. In this temple of wealth and prestige, Margaret Thompson looked like she had wandered in from another world entirely. Margaret made her way to the information desk, her worn shoes silent against the marble floor. The young woman behind the counter, her nameplate read Ashley, was engaged in an animated conversation with a colleague about weekend plans. Margaret stood patiently, waiting to be acknowledged. Minutes passed. Ashley continued her conversation, occasionally glancing at Margaret but making no move to help her. Finally, Margaret cleared her throat gently. "Excuse me, dear," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'd like to speak with someone about opening an account." Ashley looked up with barely concealed annoyance. "Ma'am, you'll need to take a number and wait in line like everyone else." She gestured dismissively toward the customer service area, where several well-dressed individuals sat in leather chairs. Margaret nodded politely. "Of course. Thank you." She made her way to the number dispenser and pulled ticket 47. The digital display showed they were currently serving number 31. With a soft sigh, Margaret found an empty chair in the corner and settled in to wait. Around her, the bank hummed with activity. She watched as customers came and went, businessmen in expensive suits discussing million-dollar loans, elegantly dressed women arranging trust funds, young professionals setting up investment portfolios. Each was greeted with smiles, offered coffee or water, and ushered quickly to available representatives. Margaret waited. An hour passed. Then another. The number on the display crawled forward with agonizing slowness. Margaret shifted in her chair, feeling the weight of suspicious glances from both staff and customers. She noticed how people gave her a wide berth, as if poverty might be contagious.
Officer Bradley Jenkins had worked security at First National Bank for 12 years. In that time, he had developed what he considered a keen eye for trouble. He prided himself on being able to spot potential problems before they became actual problems. and right now, his attention was focused entirely on the elderly woman in the corner. Something about her didn't sit right with him. She'd been sitting there for over 2 hours, clutching that old handbag like it contained the crown jewels. Her clothes were shabby, her appearance unkempt by the bank's standards. What was she really doing here? Jenkins had seen it all: scam artists, mentally ill individuals who caused disruptions, homeless people seeking shelter from the weather. In his experience, people who looked like Margaret Thompson didn't belong in a place like First National Bank. He approached his supervisor, Richard Hawthorne, a stern man in his 50s who took the bank's reputation very seriously. "Rich, we might have a situation," Jenkins said quietly, nodding toward Margaret. "That old woman's been sitting there for hours. She says she wants to open an account. But look at her. Does she look like she has money to deposit?" Hawthorne followed Jenkins' gaze and frowned. "Has she caused any disturbances?" "Not yet, but she's making the other customers uncomfortable." Mrs. Wellington mentioned she felt unsafe with that type of person in the bank. Mrs. Wellington was the wife of one of the bank's most important clients, a woman whose husband's construction company held over $50 million in various accounts with the institution. Her comfort was paramount. Hawthorne nodded grimly. "Handle it discreetly. We can't have paying customers feeling uncomfortable." Jenkins straightened his uniform and approached Margaret with the confident stride of someone used to exercising authority. Margaret looked up as his shadow fell across her chair, her pale blue eyes meeting his stern gaze. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who expected to be obeyed. Margaret blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry? Is there a problem? I have my number. I'm waiting to be called." "Ma'am, this is a private financial institution. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Around her, she became aware that conversations had stopped, that people were staring. Heat rose in her cheeks as the humiliation washed over her. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm a customer, or I'm trying to be one." Jenkins' expression hardened. "Ma'am, let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. You need to leave. Now." Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them back. She had endured too much in her 78 years to let this man see her cry. Slowly, with as much dignity as she could muster, she stood from her chair. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," she said quietly. "Perhaps I could speak with a manager?" "I am the manager's representative in this matter," Jenkins replied firmly. "And I'm telling you to leave." The bank had fallen silent now. Every eye in the building was trained on the spectacle unfolding in the corner. Margaret felt the weight of their stares, the mixture of curiosity, pity, and in some cases, approval on their faces. With her head held high despite the burning shame in her chest, Margaret began the long walk toward the exit. Each step felt like an eternity as she passed the marble pillars, the teller windows, the comfortable seating areas where wealthy customers conducted their business in privacy and comfort. She could hear the whispers starting as she passed. "Poor thing, probably doesn't even realize where she is. About time someone did something. This is a respectable establishment. I feel sorry for her, but she really doesn't belong here." The words cut deep, but Margaret kept walking. She had learned long ago that sometimes dignity was the only thing you had left, and she would not surrender it now. As she approached the exit, she passed a group of well-dressed women who were waiting to meet with their financial advisor. One of them, a woman Margaret recognized as Mrs. Wellington from the newspaper society pages, spoke just loudly enough for her to hear. "Honestly, I don't know what this world is coming to. Standards have just completely disappeared." Margaret paused, her hand on the door handle. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, not anger, exactly, but something harder. Something that suggested there was more to Margaret Thompson than anyone in this bank could possibly imagine. But the moment passed, and she stepped through the doors into the bright afternoon sunlight. Outside the bank, Margaret found a bench and sat down heavily. Her hands were shaking now, not from age but from the adrenaline of humiliation. She opened her worn handbag and pulled out a faded photograph, a wedding picture from 1965, showing a young woman with bright eyes and a radiant smile standing next to a handsome man in a military uniform. Margaret's fingers traced the edges of the photograph as memories flooded back. She had been beautiful once, confident and full of dreams. She and Robert had been planning their future together when he shipped out to Vietnam. The wedding was supposed to happen when he returned. He never did. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. Margaret remembered that detail with crystal clarity because she had been baking cookies for the church fundraiser, and the kitchen still smelled of vanilla when the uniformed officer knocked on her door. After that, life became a series of struggles and small defeats. She worked as a seamstress, then a cleaning lady, then a cafeteria worker at the local school. She never married, never had children, never built the life she had dreamed of with Robert. But she had survived. She had endured poverty, loneliness, and the casual cruelty of a world that had little patience for those who struggled. She had watched the neighborhood around her change, seen small businesses replaced by corporate chains, seen friends pass away one by one until she was among the few remaining links to an earlier time. Through it all, she had maintained her dignity, her kindness, and her faith that someday, things might get better. Today had shaken that faith, but not destroyed it. What no one in that bank could have known, what Margaret herself had only learned 3 weeks ago, was that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. It started with a knock on the door of her small apartment. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit had introduced himself as Thomas Blackwood, a senior partner at Blackwood, Harrison and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the state. Margaret had assumed he was there by mistake, that he was looking for someone else in the building. But when he asked if she was Margaret Thompson, formerly Margaret O'Sullivan, daughter of Patrick O'Sullivan who had emigrated from Ireland in 1923, her confusion only deepened. "Mrs. Thompson," he had said, settling into her worn couch with careful formality. "I'm here regarding the estate of Cornelius O'Sullivan." The name meant nothing to Margaret. She had told him so, explaining that her father Patrick had been an only child, that there were no other O'Sullivans in their family that she knew of. But Thomas Blackwood had done his homework. He spread out documents on her coffee table, genealogical charts, immigration records, birth certificates dating back over a century. Slowly, painstakingly, he traced the connection that Margaret never knew existed. Cornelius O'Sullivan had been her father's cousin, a man who had emigrated to America 5 years before Patrick. Unlike Patrick, who had struggled to make a living as a construction worker, Cornelius had possessed a sharp mind for business and an almost supernatural ability to recognize opportunities. He had started with nothing, just like Patrick, but he had invested his first savings in a small piece of land outside what would eventually become Silicon Valley. Then another piece, then another. Over the decades, he had built a real estate empire that stretched across 3 states. But Cornelius O'Sullivan had been a solitary man. He never married, had no children, and as far as anyone knew, no surviving family. When he died at the age of 103, his lawyers had spent 2 years searching for any living relatives who might have a claim to his vast fortune. That search had led them to Margaret, #Chapter 8. "The moment of truth, I don't understand," Margaret had said, staring at the documents spread across her table. "You're saying this man, this cousin I never knew existed, left me money?" Thomas Blackwood had smiled, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him since he'd arrived. "Mrs. Thompson, Cornelius O'Sullivan's estate is worth approximately $1.2 billion. After taxes and legal fees, your inheritance will be just over $980 million. The words had hung in the air like something from a dream. Margaret had asked him to repeat them, certain she had misheard. But the numbers remained the same, impossible and real. For 3 weeks, she had carried this secret, unable to fully believe it, afraid to trust that it wasn't some elaborate mistake or cruel joke. The lawyers had been thorough. There were DNA tests, document verifications, multiple confirmations that she was indeed the sole surviving heir to Cornelius O'Sullivan's fortune. But it hadn't felt real until this morning, when Thomas Blackwood had called to tell her that all the legal requirements had been satisfied and that the inheritance was officially hers. He had issued her a cashier's check for the full amount and suggested she deposit it in a secure account at a reputable bank. First National Bank had been his recommendation. Margaret sat on the bench for nearly an hour, processing what had just happened and deciding what to do next. The humiliation still burned, but underneath it, something else was growing, a quiet determination that surprised her with its intensity. She thought about all the times in her life when she had been dismissed, overlooked, or treated as invisible. She thought about the years of struggling to pay rent, of choosing between medicine and groceries, of wearing the same dress to church because it was the only nice one she owned. She thought about Robert and what he would have said about the way she had been treated today. Robert had always believed that dignity was not something that others could give you or take away. It was something you possessed regardless of your circumstances. He had respected everyone equally, from the generals who commanded him to the local children who played in the streets of their neighborhood. Margaret. She could almost hear him saying, "You have every right to be in that bank. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Rising from the bench, Margaret walked back toward the bank with measured steps. This time, she did not hurry or hesitate. She pushed through the glass doors and walked directly to the information desk. Ashley looked up with undisguised annoyance. "Ma'am, I thought you were asked to leave." "I was," Margaret replied calmly. "But I have business to conduct here, and I intend to conduct it." Within moments, Officer Jenkins appeared at Margaret's side, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment that she had returned. "Ma'am, we've been through this. You were asked to leave and you left. You cannot keep coming back here and causing disruptions." "I haven't caused any disruption," Margaret said quietly. "I simply want to open an account and make a deposit." By now, the scene was attracting attention throughout the bank. Richard Hawthorne, the security supervisor, approached with several additional staff members. Margaret found herself surrounded by a circle of bank employees, all looking at her with expressions ranging from annoyance to outright hostility. "Mrs. Hawthorne began. Thompson. Margaret Thompson. Mrs. Thompson, this establishment serves a very specific clientele. I'm sure there are other banks in the area that would be more appropriate for your needs." The words were carefully chosen, polite on the surface but carrying an unmistakable message. Margaret was not their kind of customer. She was not welcome here. Around them, other customers had stopped their transactions to watch the spectacle. Some looked uncomfortable with the situation, but none spoke up. In a place where money talked and appearances mattered above all else, a poorly dressed elderly woman had no allies. "I believe," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger, "that you are making assumptions about me that are not accurate." Jenkins stepped closer, his hand resting on his radio. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again. You need to leave these premises immediately, or I will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." The threat hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret felt the eyes of everyone in the bank upon her, waiting to see what this shabby old woman would do when faced with the full authority of the institution. For a moment, she wavered. Part of her wanted to turn around and walk away again, to find another bank where she wouldn't face such treatment. It would be easier, less confrontational, more in keeping with the quiet life she had always lived. But then she thought about the check in her handbag. She thought about Cornelius O'Sullivan, a man who had built an empire from nothing because he refused to accept the limitations others tried to place on him. She thought about all the Margaret Thompsons in the world who were dismissed and discounted because of how they looked or where they came from. And she made her decision. Margaret reached into her worn handbag with deliberate slowness, conscious that every eye in the bank was following her movements. The whispers had died away completely. The silence was so complete that the hum of the air conditioning seemed thunderously loud. Her fingers closed around the envelope that Thomas Blackwood had given her that morning. It was thick, formal, bearing the embossed logo of Blackwood, Harrison and Associates. She withdrew it carefully and held it at her side. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the marble-walled space. "I believe you mentioned that this bank serves a very specific clientele. I'd like to know exactly what the minimum deposit requirement is for opening an account here." Hawthorne looked taken aback by the question. "Ma'am, our premium accounts require a minimum deposit of $100,000, but that's not really the point." "100,000, Margaret repeated thoughtfully. "And for your private banking services?" "Our private banking division serves clients with deposits of $5 million or more. But Mrs. Thompson, I don't see how this is relevant. And your wealth management services?" Now Hawthorne looked genuinely confused. "Our wealth management division handles portfolios beginning at $50 million, but I fail to see." Margaret nodded as if this information was exactly what she had expected to hear. Around the circle of bank employees, she could see confusion replacing certainty. The customers who had been watching the drama with expressions of superiority were now beginning to look uncertain. "I see," Margaret said quietly. "So if I were to deposit, say, $1 billion, that would certainly qualify me for all of your services?" The question hung in the air like something surreal. Jenkins actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of sound. "Lady, if you had $1 billion, you sure as hell wouldn't be dressed like that." Margaret's eyes flashed, and for the first time, there was steel in her voice. "Young man, let me share something with you about assumptions. They have a way of making fools of people who rely on them too heavily." She opened the envelope. The cashier's check was a work of art in itself, thick, cream-colored paper with watermarks and security features that made it immediately recognizable as genuine. Margaret unfolded it with reverence, holding it so that the amount was clearly visible to those standing closest to her. The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Jenkins was the first to see the numbers clearly. His face went white, then red, then white again. His mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish out of water. Richard Hawthorne leaned forward, squinting at the check as if it might be some sort of optical illusion. When the reality sank in, he took a step backward, his face a mask of shock and growing horror. The check was made out to Margaret Thompson. The amount, written in both numbers and words with legal precision, was $980,000,000.980 million. "My God," someone whispered. Margaret wasn't sure who had spoken. The sound seemed to come from the air itself. Around the circle, bank employees began to react. Ashley from the information desk had gone completely pale and was gripping the counter for support. The tellers who had ignored Margaret for 2 hours were staring with expressions of absolute disbelief. But it was the customers' reactions that Margaret found most interesting. Mrs. Wellington, who had made the comment about standards, had turned a sickly shade of green. The businessmen who had been discussing their million-dollar loans looked like they had been struck by lightning. Margaret folded the check carefully and returned it to the envelope, then looked up at the circle of faces surrounding her. "Now then," she said calmly, "I believe I would like to speak with the bank president about opening an account." What happened next could only be described as controlled chaos. Richard Hawthorne began barking orders to his staff while simultaneously trying to maintain some semblance of professional demeanor. Ashley was dispatched to call the bank president's office immediately. 2 junior managers appeared as if from thin air, their faces wreathed in nervous smiles. Officer Jenkins had backed away from Margaret as if she had suddenly become radioactive. The confident authority he had displayed just minutes before had evaporated completely, replaced by a dawning recognition of just how catastrophically he had mishandled the situation. "Mrs. Thompson," Hawthorne began, his voice now carrying a completely different tone. Obsequious where it had been dismissive, panicked where it had been authoritative. We. There seems to have been a terrible misunderstanding." Margaret regarded him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the entire encounter. "Has there been? I'm not sure I understand what you mean." The words were polite, but there was something in Margaret's tone that made several people shift uncomfortably. She was not going to make this easy for them. "Please," Hawthorne continued, gesturing toward the VIP seating area that Margaret had watched other customers use throughout her long wait. "Allow us to make you comfortable while we arrange for President Morrison to meet with you personally." Margaret looked at the plush leather chairs, the mahogany coffee table with its selection of financial magazines and newspapers, the sidebar with crystal glasses and expensive bottled water. Then she looked back at the worn chair in the corner where she had spent over 2 hours being ignored and eventually humiliated. "That's very kind of you," she said, "but I'm quite comfortable where I am." She walked back to her original seat and sat down, folding her hands in her lap with the same patience she had shown before. The difference was that now, instead of being ignored, she was the center of frantic attention. President James Morrison was in a board meeting on the 15th floor when his secretary burst in with news that would change his day, and possibly his career. A woman with a check for nearly $1 billion was sitting in his lobby, and his staff had apparently tried to have her thrown out of the bank. Morrison was a man who had built his career on understanding numbers and their implications. A deposit of $980 million would make his bank one of the most significant financial institutions in the region. The fees and investment opportunities from managing such wealth would be transformative. But more importantly, the story of how his staff had treated this customer would spread through the financial community like wildfire if not handled properly. Banks lived and died on their reputations, and the reputation of turning away a billionaire because of her appearance would be devastating. He ended his board meeting immediately and took the elevator down to the main floor, his mind racing through damage control scenarios and recovery strategies. When the elevator doors opened, Morrison was struck by the surreal scene before him. In the corner sat an elderly woman in a faded dress, surrounded by his entire management staff like courtiers attending a queen. Other customers were lingering in the lobby, clearly unwilling to leave before seeing how this extraordinary situation played out. Morrison approached Margaret with measured steps, his practiced banker's smile firmly in place despite the gravity of the situation. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, extending his hand, "I'm James Morrison, president of First National Bank. I understand there may have been some confusion regarding your visit today." Margaret looked up at him with those same pale blue eyes that had been so easily dismissed an hour before. Now those eyes seemed to see right through his polished exterior to the calculations happening behind it. "Confusion," she repeated softly. "Is that what we're calling it?" Morrison's smile faltered slightly, but he maintained his professional composure. "Perhaps we could speak privately in my office? I'm sure we can resolve any issues and discuss how First National Bank can best serve your financial needs." Margaret considered this for a moment. "I think not," she said finally. "What happened here today happened in public, in front of all these people. I think any discussion we have should be equally public." The words sent a chill through Morrison. He glanced around at the crowd of customers and staff, all hanging on every word. Several people were holding smartphones, and he realized with growing alarm that this encounter was likely being recorded and would soon be shared across social media. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, lowering his voice in an attempt to encourage her to do the same, "I can only imagine how you must be feeling, but surely we can handle this matter with discretion." "Can we?" Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying clearly through the marble space. "Was discretion shown when your security guard accused me of not belonging here? Was discretion shown when I was asked to leave because I made other customers uncomfortable? Was discretion shown when I was threatened with arrest for the crime of trying to open a bank account?" Each question hit Morrison like a physical blow. Around him, he could see his staff exchanging panicked glances, realizing that their treatment of Margaret had been witnessed by multiple customers who could corroborate her account. Officer Jenkins had retreated to the far side of the lobby, his face a mask of dread. Richard Hawthorne stood frozen, understanding that his career was likely over regardless of how this situation was resolved. Margaret continued, her voice never rising but carrying an authority that commanded absolute attention. "When I walked into this bank this morning, I was prepared to deposit nearly $1 billion and establish a long-term relationship with this institution. I was prepared to trust you with my financial future." She paused, letting the magnitude of that statement sink in. "Instead, I was judged, dismissed, and humiliated because I didn't look like your typical customer. Because I'm old, because my clothes are simple, because I don't fit your image of what wealth should look like." As Margaret spoke, something unexpected began to happen. Several of the customers who had witnessed her treatment began to step forward, their expressions showing a mixture of shame and growing anger at what they had seen. Dr. Sarah Chun, a physician who had been waiting to discuss a business loan, was the first to speak. "I saw the entire thing," she said, her voice clear and firm. "This woman was treated disgracefully. She was polite, patient, and did nothing to warrant the treatment she received." An elderly gentleman in an expensive suit nodded in agreement. "I've been banking here for 20 years, and I've never seen anything so unprofessional." The lady was clearly being discriminated against based on her appearance. Even some of Morrison's own staff began to look uncomfortable as the reality of the situation crystallized. Several tellers who had watched Margaret sit in the corner for hours began to realize that their indifference had contributed to the crisis now facing their employer. Mrs. Wellington, who had made the comment about standards, had quietly slipped away, perhaps recognizing that her own behavior would not reflect well under scrutiny. Morrison felt control of the situation slipping away from him with each passing moment. This was no longer just about one customer complaint. It was becoming a public relations nightmare with potential legal ramifications. "Mrs. Thompson," he said desperately, "please allow me to apologize on behalf of First National Bank. What happened here today was completely unacceptable and does not reflect our values or standards." Margaret tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. "Doesn't it?" she asked quietly. "Because from where I sit, it seems to reflect them perfectly." The truth in Margaret's words hung heavy in the air. Morrison realized that no amount of corporate damage control could undo what had happened or change the fundamental attitudes that had led to this moment. "What would you like me to do?" he asked, abandoning pretense and speaking with genuine desperation. "How can we make this right?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering her response. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of a lifetime's experience with prejudice and dismissal. "Mr. Morrison, the question isn't what you can do for me. The question is what you're going to do to ensure that no one else is treated the way I was treated today. The question is whether this institution will continue to judge people's worth based on their appearance, or whether it will actually live up to the values it claims to represent." She stood slowly, her dignity intact despite everything she had endured. "You see, I don't actually need your bank. With the resources I now have available to me, I can choose from any financial institution in the world. I can work with private wealth managers who would be honored to handle my account. I can invest with firms that would treat me with the respect that should be afforded to any human being, regardless of their economic status." Morrison felt his worst fears materializing. Not only was he losing a potentially transformative client, but the story of how First National Bank had treated her would follow them for years to come. "But Mrs. Thompson," he said, grasping for any hope, "surely we can demonstrate that we've learned from this mistake. We can show you that we're better than what happened here today." Margaret smiled then, but it was a sad smile, filled with the wisdom of someone who had seen too much of human nature to be easily surprised by it. "The mistake, Mr. Morrison, wasn't in how your staff treated me. The mistake was in your hiring practices, your training procedures, and the culture you've created in this institution. The mistake was in building a place where appearance matters more than character, where assumptions matter more than facts." Margaret walked slowly around the lobby, her eyes taking in the marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the expensive furnishings that were designed to impress and intimidate. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful, almost philosophical. "You know, when I was a young woman, I worked as a seamstress. I made clothes for wealthy ladies who would come to our shop and treat my mother and me like we were invisible. They would discuss their personal business right in front of us, as if we were pieces of furniture instead of human beings." She paused by one of the marble pillars, running her weathered hand along its smooth surface. "I learned then that some people believe that money gives them the right to treat others as less than human. But I also learned something else, that true worth has nothing to do with the size of your bank account." The lobby had fallen completely silent. Even the staff members who weren't directly involved in the incident had gathered to listen, drawn by the quiet power of Margaret's words. "The man whose fortune I inherited, Cornelius O'Sullivan, he understood this. Despite his wealth, he lived simply, dressed modestly, and treated everyone he met with respect. He once told his lawyers that the measure of a man wasn't in what he accumulated, but in how he treated those who had less than he did." Margaret turned back to Morrison, her pale blue eyes meeting his directly. "Today, your institution failed that test completely." Morrison felt the weight of judgment settling around him like a shroud. Everything Margaret said was true, and worse, it was witnessed by dozens of people who would carry this story beyond the walls of his bank. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what can I do to earn your forgiveness?" Margaret considered this question for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. When she answered, Her response surprised everyone in the room. "It's not your forgiveness you should be worried about, Mr. Morrison. It's theirs." She gestured around the lobby, indicating not just the people present, but everyone who might face similar treatment in the future. "If you want to make this right, here's what you'll do. First, every member of your staff, from the janitors to the executives, will undergo comprehensive training on treating all customers with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or perceived economic status." Morrison nodded eagerly, pulling out his phone to make notes. "Yes, absolutely. What else?" "Second, you'll implement a formal policy that prohibits discrimination based on appearance, age, or any other superficial characteristic. And you'll enforce it with real consequences." "Done." "What else?" Margaret's next words stunned everyone in the room. "Third, you'll establish a fund, let's call it the Dignity Fund, that provides free financial services to elderly and low-income individuals who have been turned away by other institutions. You'll staff it with people who understand that respect is not something that should have to be earned through wealth." The scope of what she was proposing was staggering. Morrison realized she was essentially asking him to fundamentally transform his institution's culture and business model. But as he looked around at the faces of his staff and customers, he realized that the alternative, living with the reputation of the bank that turned away a billionaire because of her appearance, was even worse. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "if we implement all of these changes, would you consider giving First National Bank another chance?" Margaret smiled again, but this time there was warmth in her expression. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate what you're willing to do, and I believe you mean it sincerely, but I've already made my decision about where I'll be banking." Morrison's heart sank. Despite everything he had promised, despite the magnitude of the changes he was willing to make, he was still going to lose her business. "However," Margaret continued, and Morrison felt a flicker of hope, "I will be watching to see if you follow through on these commitments. And if you do, if you truly transform this institution into a place that treats all people with dignity, then perhaps we can discuss a different kind of relationship." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a business card that Thomas Blackwood had given her. "I'm establishing a foundation dedicated to supporting elderly individuals who have faced discrimination or hardship. If First National Bank demonstrates genuine change, I might consider using your services for the foundation's banking needs." Morrison looked at the card and felt his breath catch. The foundation was being established with an initial endowment of $100 million. Even a fraction of that business would be significant, but more importantly, having Margaret Thompson's foundation as a client would demonstrate to the financial community that First National had truly changed its ways. "But," Margaret added, and her tone became firm again, "if I hear of anyone else being treated the way I was treated today, that possibility disappears forever.